I know I said I was going to make a series of videos called The Marks of Capital. I've decided I'm not going to do series at all anymore. I'm just going to make whatever video I want because it's my channel. I do what I want, and I got ADHD. I'm not going to focus long enough to make a series of videos on one topic. In feminist theory, there's a methodology called autoethnography, and autoethnography is really interesting because it's a way of talking about how our personal experiences, it's sort of interpreting theory through actual lived experience, and I think this is actually a really good approach in general. So that's kind of going to be the vibe of this channel. It's going to be a little bit more vloggy than what it's been previously, but it's also going to be a bit more harder on the theory too. It's going to be theories that I'm learning about that's within the academic discourse, but also the way that I kind of actually engage with this stuff as a human being as well. And I guess my hope is that it's going to help you, the people watching, to kind of just think about the world in a slightly different way and start noticing stuff like this around the place. So let's get into race. So race is a social construct. If you've seen the latest Philosophy Tube video at time of recording, then you will be across the general gist of what a social construct actually is. Because obviously the physical attributes that are more common within different, sort of like along different genetic lines and stuff, that's obviously pretty indisputable. But what things are important and how we divide people up into groups for political purposes, that's kind of made up. But nonetheless, like, continuity is something that feels very important. Like, if we're not able to find continuity with a social group, it's really difficult to place yourself and navigate the world. And it's I don't know, it's hard to put into words because this is sort of a feeling, you know? But really what I'm trying to get into is how does culture fit into race? Because those things get tied together a lot. And culture is obviously socially constructed, but nonetheless, you can't just kind of make up a new thing from scratch and have that be social. Like, people have to accept it. You know, there has to be a group of people who kind of socially agree and keep recreating certain norms, and that's kind of how social constructs form. So, as a white Australian, what's my culture? That's really complicated. So, for a start, I'm from a settler people. My lineage is settlers. You know, I've got a lot of sort of Celtic ancestry on both sides of my family, really. Bit of English in there, you know, it's all, you know, the islands we call the British Isles, even though a lot of them aren't actually British, but turns out being neighbours to the people who did more colonialism than anyone else is not an easy gig. But anyway, but like, white Australia as a whole, right, is not British, is it? Is it? It's not, is it? Surely not. We've been acting like it's not, and it's all socially constructed, so the way that we act like it is how it is within that construct, right? Like, that's how that works. So, if there's a difference, how do we claim that difference? Like, what's the point where Australia stopped being Britain? So if we look into the Australian cultural narratives, there's a few points that kind of people keep coming back to. So Ned Kelly is a point of distinction. If you're not Australian and don't know who Ned Kelly is kind of like, if you can imagine if Robin Hood had a soup can on his head and there were guns involved and he was also a lot more violent, that's kind of Ned Kelly. Ned Kelly was an Irish Australian who put up with a bunch of shit from British imperialism, got into a shootout with some police. He was wearing some armor that was pretty iconic. There's a bunch of other people like him who we know as bushrangers, but Ned Kelly's the iconic one because he had this like cylindrical metal helmet and, you know, sort of homemade armor and stuff, and so he survived this police shootout for a lot longer than people thought he was going to, and so that's become like a symbol for like Australian anti-authoritarianism. So because Ned Kelly was an Irish Australian facing off against British imperial forces, that's kind of like a thing where it's like, we're not British anymore because we side with Ned Kelly. Ned Kelly is white Australian. The cops are British. Simple. Another point is, that people look to is the the Eureka Stockade. So the Eureka Stockade is also interesting. So there was a gold rush in Australia in a place called Ballarat in Victoria, and we had a lot of migrants from a bunch of different countries. The British started charging people, started taxing people and stuff. And by the British, I mean the British establishment, because there were a lot of working class people of British descent who were also working the goldfields. And so what happened was there was a workers' union. They started up this kind of whole socialist movement thing. It was really cool. And then shit got violent. There was a shootout at a stockade. And that was this kind of thing. Again, it was white Australians and other migrants, mostly European migrants, but a couple others, mostly European at that point, versus British Imperial forces. And they flew this flag that just had a Southern Cross on it with a white cross in the middle. But the problem is that the following year, a bunch of, there was a massive influx of Chinese miners. And then a very similar flag, if not the exact same flag, got used to represent the anti-Chinese sentiment. And so that's why racists still use that flag today. So anyway, point is, we've got two kind of big things that define white Australians as non-British, being Ned Kelly and the Eureka Stockade. We've also got Gallipoli. Now, Gallipoli that's probably the one that's the most clearly in the public consciousness, because we celebrate Anzac Day, which is where we remember the sacrifice of people who went to the wrong beach and died for a different country. But it was really important because that was the first time that we flew our own flag rather than just flying Britain's flag. So we were still fighting for the British in Europe, in Turkey, on the wrong beach, and we lost. And that's what we remember once a year. So those are sort of the three things that are seen as the split off. There's some problems with some of these, though. So the first one being Gallipoli, and that whole thing was in service of the British Empire. So definitively not British. Oh yeah, we also beat England at cricket, because nothing quite says we're not England than winning the most English game of all time. So there's that too. Sport's important, I guess. I might do a thing on the politics of sport. I think Hardcore Line might have done something. He was at least talking about doing that. If there is, there'll be a little card come up. The Eureka Stockade, like I said, got co-opted by xenophobes almost immediately. And so if, like me, you're not the biggest fan of colonialism, that's not great, because you can't fly a Eureka flag and be like, hey, socialist ideals, the oppressed of all nations, which is what it was originally about, because people are just like, no, you are racist. You hate Asian people. So that's not good. Ned Kelly, interesting one. So the thing about Ned Kelly is that if you look at all the things that Ned Kelly was upset about, the list looks pretty similar to what colonialism did to the indigenous population. And so Ned Kelly kind of gives us white Australians an opportunity to say, we're the oppressed ones. The British did that to us. And also the whole, the convict history and everything happens as well. But because I'm South Australian, and also my ancestry in this country is all migrated post the convict settlement thing. I can't really claim that one personally, but nonetheless, there's this whole mechanism of white victimization in this whole thing that is actually used to displace what happened to the Aboriginal groups in this country. So, who committed the genocide is my next question. If white Australia has claimed continuity with Irish Australians, then there's this notion of we didn't do it, that was the British. The British oppressed a lot of people, especially us. There's this whole, yeah. But then at the same time, Irish Australians, and not just Irish Australians, but anyone who migrated here as part of the colonial project, you can't get away from the fact that we're complicit in that. Colonization is not a thing that just happened in the late 18th century and early 19th century. It's something that's still going on now, in fact. We keep sort of just taking land and acting as though it's owned, even though there was no treaties have been drawn up. There is no treaty. So we haven't even done that much. That's pretty terrible. So anyway, so who's responsible for colonialism and genocide? That's a big question. I'm benefiting from it, even if I didn't personally do anything, my ancestors did actually. My dad's side migrated from Northern Ireland a lot more recently, but my mum's side of the family came over in the 19th century and did the whole sort of Christian assimilation-y, civilizing the savages. It had that kind of a vibe. So there's definitely some complicity in my ancestry there. So where does that leave me? Because if I claim my Irishness, then what culture do I adopt? Do I stick with what I've always done? Do I stick with what is essentially white Australian culture? If I do, then I have to acknowledge the fact that the culture I'm participating in is it only exists because of colonialism and genocide. If I claim my Northern Irish heritage and claim my culture from that, I don't really belong to those people. If I went back to where I came from and that was Belfast, I don't have the same accent as everyone. Have you heard Northern Irish accents? If you hear a thick Belfast accent and you're not accustomed to it, so it's I don't really belong there, and of course we all can't do that. There's not enough space in Europe. The European diaspora is so big now. We can't fit everyone back in Europe. And also, by the way, I've never heard an Aboriginal person or an Indigenous person of any nation, I've never heard any person like that say, you all need to go back where you came from. And it's sort of because, white culture's got a very xenophobic kind of a streak, and we're very big on the whole go back to where you came from thing. And so that's our solution to everything. But no, we don't get to do that. We can't. We physically cannot do that. And that's not what is necessary anyway. And this is the thing that's really hard to wrestle with, especially as a white Australian, is we can't go back. We can't go back. And a lot of our culture is just English culture that's been superimposed onto this country. But it's bizarre because it doesn't make any sense for where we are. We celebrate Christmas, which is supposed to be a riff on the winter solstice, a feast during the winter solstice. It's supposed to be lights in the dark and all this wonderful stuff. But it's the middle of summer here. Some people still cook roasts when it's 40 degrees Celsius outside. What? We celebrate Easter, which was appropriated from pagan rebirth festivals. That's in autumn. We celebrate rebirth and new life in autumn. We're starting to do Halloween now. In spring. The sun, in Adelaide at least, where the part of the world I'm from, it doesn't get dark until after 9 o'clock, maybe even 10 o'clock or so. It is not even a little bit spooky. Easter time, that's a spooky time of year. So, but we've just uncritically taken on all of this stuff and it doesn't make any sense. So if I want to get a connection to the land, what am I supposed to do? Just start appropriating indigenous culture? No, because that's continuing colonialism. That's me colonizing the actual culture of indigenous people. That's messed up. I don't want to do that. So what am I left with? I have intentions, by the way, of having a talk to some local elders and figuring out how to most appropriately participate in the culture of this land, because, again, the English stuff, it's from the other side of the world. The time of year is 6 months out of whack on every single respect. And so the disconnect from the land is wild. But at the same time, I can't just waltz in and take the culture of what's here, because the continuity that I come from has taken so much. This is actually one of the advantages that a lot of North American settler peoples actually have, is that the climate and the landscape in North America is close enough to Europe that you can actually take a bunch of European practices and just ship them over to North America, and it translates pretty well. The same kind of plants are able to grow, that sort of thing. But over here, the land is so different. We can't just take stuff. And there's there are sort of like anti-establishment, sort of witchy, pagany things going around, which, because you can sort of claim that as being anti-imperial in a way because it's anti-patriarchal, certainly in a lot of respects. But that stuff itself has also appropriated a lot of stuff from North American indigenous cultures, which means that not only is it appropriative of a colonized people, but it still doesn't make any sense for the land where I am right now. So where do I claim continuity? Do I claim continuity with the colonizers? Do I claim continuity with the land? Do I claim continuity with my Northern Irish heritage, which is, by the way, it's not British. That's kind of it. I have the church. I grew up in the church. If I look to my Northern Irish ancestry, it's Protestant. That's got a bunch of traditions. But again, doesn't make sense to like a lot of the stuff that we've taken doesn't make sense to the land. And I've thought a bit about not considering myself a Christian anymore for a while, because it doesn't jive with the way that I see the world in a lot of ways. It's a bit too exclusive. I'm way too plural for that. But I can't get away from the fact that spiritual practice is necessary for me. But here's the thing about continuity, right? Is that the way that social constructs happen is that everyone kind of agrees on stuff, and then it gets recreated. Every time... So let's use gender, for example. Every time someone identifies as a man and does something, what they're doing is they're creating a version of masculinity. And a lot of it will conform to broader concepts of what masculinity is. But they will recreate a version of masculinity. And over time, sort of the general impression of all the individual people recreating their own little version of masculinity creates the overall impression of masculinity. But what that means is that we as individuals have the ability to change what social constructs are and what they mean. And this is especially true for cultural practices, because cultural practices are practice. They're doing, they're active, they're dynamic. So if I claim my continuity from Christianity, and of course within Christianity I've got a bunch of different streams I can claim, and I'm probably going to go with the mystic stream. Yes, Christianity has been central in the colonization project. And yes, Christianity is highly problematic and everything, but if I claim its continuity, and if I perform enough things that it's clear that that's the tradition that I'm participating in, I get to redefine what Christianity is. I get to create a decolonized Australian version of Christianity that still has enough continuity that I feel like I belong somewhere. I can place myself culturally. And even on a non-spiritual note, I can do the same thing with European philosophy. Like I can very easily claim continuity with that. I'm currently studying psychology. I can claim continuity with Western psychology, and I can then participate in a decolonized version of that too. So what does a decolonized version of Christianity look like, and what does a decolonized version of philosophy and psychology look like? Well, obviously that's a very complex thing to talk about, but I think Christianity is one that is probably easy to talk about, because Christianity has had many different versions of itself. There's, because, for example, Greek and Russian Orthodox looks very different to Catholicism, which looks very different to Anglicanism and other forms of Protestantism. And so, given that it's in flux, given that it's dynamic, given that there are localized and idiosyncratic versions of every ideological set that are being created and recreated constantly, I can consciously create one that respectfully engages with indigenous connections to the land. One that doesn't claim to be indigenous, but one that seeks guidance from the people who've been living on this land, the people, if you want to get into Christian, like a Christian framework and how you would frame this within a decolonized Christianity, the people that God placed on this land and placed this land under their care. You know? So if I go and I talk to some elders, some Paramank and Ghana elders, because those are the lands that I live on, then I can find out how to make sort of almost a hybrid version, and not one that utilizes practices and not one that appropriates, but one that seeks guidance on how to engage with the land spiritually. And one that still utilizes, and this is the thing, because I'm in South Australia, there's a lot of wine around, there's some great food. So bread, wine, those are the base elements of Christianity. You have that, you've basically got all you need to do like a hyper-minimalist church. And so one that is able to find new ways of celebrating, new ways of engaging with the cycle of the Christian calendar, and be able to place that with Australian seasons and the Australian climate and things that are available here now, and not just in some idealized pre-colonial version, but things as they are now. Like I said, we can't go back where we came from. You know, we don't get to control Z our way out of this. We don't get to just keep hitting undo until it all goes away and all of the infrastructure goes away and we all bog off back to Europe. It's, you know, we're stuck here. The only way out is through and forwards. And so we cannot go back to we can't go back to any old idealized version of the past. We can only create an idealized future. And the way to that is by engaging as thoroughly as we can with the reconciliation project. It's by not shying away from the fact that we have continuity with forces that have been used to colonize so much of the planet. Because there's not something that you can just go to that's not problematic or perpetuating colonialism in one form or another, be that the colonization even of Irish people, you know? They've been neighbors to the Brits for a long time. You know, they've had a rough time of things. Like, we can't just start appropriating that stuff willy-nilly. Again, similar to what I was saying with Christianity, you can respectfully do your research and speak to people who actually use those practices in a way that is living and dynamic and real, and you can take notes from that with permission, and use that for your own context. It's a very fine line between appropriation and incorporation, I guess you'd call it. But that's it. We're stuck here. This is the land I was born on. This is the country I belong to. I'm Australian and I can't get away from that. My tradition is Christianity, and it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter what I believe. That's the continuity that got me to where I am. And even if I did ditch Christianity, I've still got Western philosophy, which gave us the Enlightenment and Cartesian dualism, and really sidelined spirituality and emotion and a lot of other things that, well, and also led to social Darwinism. You know, that's a European idea. I can't get away from the fact that I come from streams of that. And social Darwinism was part of psychology, because psychology is the field that gives you all your measures of intelligence. That's being used for the colonial project too. So my point is, I can't get away from my continuity with colonization. But what I can do is I can choose how I recreate it. And that's why, despite for the last while having considered myself to be a universalist rather than a Christian, I am reclaiming the term. Because that way I get to choose what it means to be a Christian in the coming days and the coming years. And the coming generations even. And what I choose for that to be is one that is open, one that is plural, one that is non-exclusive, one that adapts to its circumstances and fights for the emancipation of all. I also get to choose what it means to be Australian. I look to Gough Whitlam, the Australian Prime Minister who made some big headway in the 1970s towards Indigenous land rights. I look to Paul Keating, who continued working on the project of reconciliation and began reversing course on child removals. There are still Indigenous people being removed from their families at a higher rate than other Australians, by the way. Like, it's not even a little... Like, colonialism is not even a little bit not still happening. But that's the thing. I am here to redefine some stuff. And I'm not going to shy away from it. And neither should you. And with that, until next time, much love.